Well, thank you so much for that wonderfully kind introduction, and um, also for having us today. We are excited to be here. As Judy said, I am the founder and president of the Association of Secular Elected Officials, which is an association of all local, state, and federal elected officials across the country that affiliate in some way with being non-religious, humanist, free thinking, atheist, agnostic. There's a long list of terms that we, of course, welcome all people. So we are here today with our partners, Secular Strategies and the Center for Free Thought Equality, to give a little talk on political activism, why it's important for secular people to be involved in politics, what you can do as an individual, what you can do as a group, and maybe even by the end convince some of you to run for office. So we are going to hear from people, and as they speak, they're going to introduce themselves. But we're going to hear from three of my fellow board members at ASEO, Danny Choriki, Sherry Dutzy, and Kristiana de Leon. We're going to hear from Ron Millar from the Center for FreeThought Equality, and hopefully we're going to hear from Sarah Levin from Secular Strategies. I don't know where she is in her travels at the moment, but I think we have a presentation, Ron, and I think you are going to bring that up, and we will get going. If at any time you have questions during this, please throw them up in the chat or raise your hand, and we will certainly try to get to all of those. So let's see. I don't know, Sarah, if you are there. And
I am here.
Okay,
Absolutely.
so here we go. Sarah, please take it away.
Absolutely. And if at any point, please let me know if my audio cuts out or if there's too much background noise. Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Levin. I'm the founder and principal at Secular Strategies, which is a consulting firm that works with nonprofits, PACs, political organizations, and as well as some corporate clients, all of which are focusing on giving voice to the growing number of religiously unaffiliated Americans. I worked for the Secular Coalition for America for 6 years, which, if you're not familiar, is a coalition of now 20 national voting member organizations, which includes, of course, the Center for Free Thought Equality, which Ron will talk a little bit more about. So I've worked with a number of different secular organizations, all in the hope that the non-religious will, as we grow as a demographic, will actually be empowered as voters to have more of an impact on policy. And so the next slide here, Ron, if you could show it. You probably heard this, and there's, especially recently, there's been more in the news about this, but this has been several years coming, that we have this really exciting trend of the religiously unaffiliated growing rapidly. And now there are less than 50% of Americans are attending church regularly. I mean, you could see from this first chart image here that a huge amount of the religiously unaffiliated are young. They're millennials, they're Gen Z, and this idea that the notion that they'll just get religious as they're older, which we've heard for many years, we now have enough data to show that that's not true. A lot of these folks are being born into secular or sometimes interfaith families, and they do remain secular as they're older overall. And so we have a lot to be excited about with that, but I always like to warn folks, one of the most dangerous assumptions we can make is that just by virtue of this demographic growing, that just somehow automatically our policies will reflect that, and somehow automatically will have adequate representation. None of those things can be taken for granted. None of them happen without the power of organizing and the involvement of folks like you. And so with this, the next slide is just emphasizes that this really caused a lot of hullabaloo in the media when this came out, even though, I think folks who have been watching this trend for a while weren't surprised. But this dip below 50% that came from Gallup a few months ago really made a splash in the news. So this next slide is really underscores that point I just made, which is that we really can't take any of these trends, as exciting as they are, to mean that somehow automatically will be adequately represented, because you can see that we are really severely underrepresented in government in general. This is the religious makeup of the current Congress, and you can see that we only have one openly non-theistic member of Congress, who that's Congressman Huffman. We do have Congressman Raskin, who identifies as a humanist, but he does not say that he doesn't believe in God. So we really only have one person currently serving in Congress who's willing to say that they're openly non-theistic. That doesn't mean he's the only non-theist in office. It's just that he's the only one who's been willing to say it openly. We do have a Congressional FreeThought Caucus, which part of their mission is to stand up for the rights of the non-religious and to advocate for the separation of church and state. And I believe they're at least 13 members strong now, if not larger. Ron can correct me on that. But, and that's a great thing to celebrate. But we do not have, representation matters, of course. And when we have 1 in 4 Americans, possibly even more, who are identifying as religiously unaffiliated, but only one member of Congress who's openly non-theistic, and very few who are in the unaffiliated category, we have a lot of work to do. And then this next slide kind of underscores that as well, because if you look at some of these other religious groups, there are a number of religious groups on here that are overrepresented, including some religious minority groups. For example, you can see that for Jewish lawmakers, there's only 2% of Americans are Jewish, but we have 6.2% of Congress representing Jewish Americans. And then, of course, we have a lot of overrepresentation among Protestants in Congress as well. And so if you look at those, and then you look at this massive gap of 26% of Americans as unaffiliated, but only 0.2% of Congress. And this is reflected at the state and local level as well. That's increasing, and that's in great part thanks to the work of organizations like the Association of Secular Elected Officials and the Center for FreeThought Equality. We're now seeing more and more people running as openly non-religious and more of them winning. But we have so much work to do to fill this humongous gap. And that's what the rest of this presentation is going to be about. And so I just want to lay this out for you as something to be really excited about. We have a great opportunity here with our demographics rising, but we need to capture the vote, the secular vote. We need to have more people like you running for office, because we have a really long road ahead. And the last thing I'll say here is just to remind you all, as an example, that there's so many policy areas today where the majority of Americans support one policy, but the policy doesn't actually reflect what most Americans want. And even though we can celebrate that the demographic trends of the religious right are decreasing, right? They're older, they're whiter, as the country becomes more diverse and younger, that doesn't necessarily mean that the threats against separation of church and state, that the rise of Christian nationalism go away, because we know that you don't necessarily have to be in the majority to be a minority ruling power in the United States, unfortunately. And so while we can really celebrate that we have this opportunity, it's really on us as a community to organize ourselves and capture that opportunity, because it won't just come on its own. So I'm going to turn it now over to Ron and the rest of the presenters. I hope you use this as just a food for thought on why it really is so important, how much work we need to do, and why we need you.
I'm not Ron.
I'm sorry. Turn it over to
okay.
Danny.
You did really well for just being on audio. I'm Danny Choriki. I was born and raised in Montana, and I spent about 30 years in New York. I first got into politics in junior high school over a dress code protest. And it's been like the second thing that I've been doing, second highest priority pretty much my entire life ever since then. lots of third-party politics, grassroots organizing, and a lot of specific issues. To me, this whole thing is probably the most important thing that I've done. And as we get into, go to the next slide, why we should be involved in this, to me, it's really, really, really important, because ultimately it's our values that are being attacked by the literalists and the ideologues in the whole religious nativist coalition. And worse than that, you know, there's an economic component to that that I won't get into too much today, but we are seeing essentially the structure of the Western world being moved back towards a feudal society. And if you want to know more about that, feel free to reach out to me. In my opinion, and a lot of other people, the United States, the values and skills that we as pragmatic Americans brought to the world created the one brief shining moment of a middle class that actually was really, really large and really, really healthy. That was right after the end of World War II. But we've been seeing that fall apart we've been seeing that fall apart over the last 2 generations, but we can take these values and bring them back to the front of American politics and make that happen once again. So let's take a look in the next slide as to what some of these things are. We are a secular humanist nation. We were founded coming out of the European Enlightenment of the 1700s. The people who were writing about this stuff, the philosophers in Scotland and Germany, you know, they were focusing more and more on the human experience and what we could find out about the human experience and understanding it in the economic sphere, in the marketplace, and in the public space. And they were making an argument essentially for getting rid of a structure that was very much class-oriented, very heavily weighted towards the top, and moving it towards something different that had never really been seen in the world before. And the founders of the American experiment were, you know, leaders in this area. They were very well read and versed in this. Now, it is very true that these founders were human beings, and because they're human beings, they were flawed. But recognizing this, what we are doing here in America, and what we're trying to redo again through the movement that we're trying to found here, is to recognize that our goal is to protect and improve the work that our flawed founding fathers created through the living constitution that they made, that was all based on Enlightenment values. So what we need to do is to return our nation to those Enlightenment values. So the next slide takes a look at why we have to do this. Anybody recognize him? Now, a lot of us will point to the internet and blame, you know, television and media and all sorts of different things for the cultural war that we're going on right now and the divisiveness that's going on in the United States. But in my mind, it really goes back to William F. Buckley's master's thesis back in the 1950s, where he basically made the argument that as a conservative, they were never going to be able to win against the pragmatic coalition of Republicans and Democrats who had centered around a very pragmatic approach to governance, which was that the government was supposed to help people out. It was supposed to do the things that it couldn't do. And Buckley's argument was that the only way that the conservatives could win was with an ideologically driven, rational argument that really had nothing to do with reality. So you take what Buckley was stating, and then you add decades of Rush Limbaugh and a couple more decades of Fox News, and you really start to see a huge disconnect right now in our culture between people who are paying attention to what's actually going on in the real world and people who are basically saying, no, there's one way, it's the right way, it's the only way to go. Now, as we move to the next slide, this is not a metaphor. This is, did y'all lose me? Oh, this is no longer just a metaphor. It's reality. It's the politics of what's actually going on right now. If I were the type of person that was going around saying, I told you so, there's a whole bunch of things that I, and probably you as well, could sit there and start pointing fingers and saying, I told you so. We were talking about the weather, just before we engaged, started this thing. And what happened as a result of what William Buckley started is essentially what is called a cultural war, but the point was to change the culture, to change the way people think about what's going on and how they view the world. And that has happened. And the triumph of what we're looking at on the screen right now and the threats that that imposes on there are directly related to essentially a cultural psychotic break that we're having here in the United States. So what can we do about it? Let's take a look at the next slide. We need to remind ourselves that, we respect science, and most of us firmly believe that evidence should be driving public policy. I think one of the biggest phrases of the last year as we went through this whole pandemic thing was follow the science, follow the science. And that really is where the cultural split is right now. And in my mind, it isn't really just about religion or anything like that. It is literally about people who believe that what's going on in their television and in their own heads is more important than us actually keeping track of and making sense out of the human experience. And by the human experience, I'm not just talking about evidence and science or technology. We're talking about history, art, culture, music, literature, ethics, the whole human experience is what humanism really kind of brings to the table. And rational arguments by themselves, especially when they're being shouted, from some corner or another, may make sense, may sound good for some people, but we really, really need to return back to a data-driven reality. So what else do we need to be thinking about? Let's take a look at the next slide. One of the structural issues is how we vote. And I could go on for a half-a-day seminar on this. I will say that Emma Goldman is often falsely attributed with saying that if elections work, they'd make them illegal. I think they can work, they do work. What's happened though is they've become more and more ineffective. And in order to fix that, we need to do some things. We need to pay attention to voting rights and civil rights. We need to think about nonpartisan primaries. We need to look at different ways of voting other than just winner takes all, so ranked choice voting, approval voting, and things like that. So there are some structural things that we need to pay attention to. And finally, as we move on to my last slide, we really need to think about the culture and how we're changing the culture. The good thing about groups like us and you guys here in Florida meeting here is one of the things that we do really well is to educate ourselves. And in most of the meetings that I've seen of these things, that's a key part of it. What we need to do in order to change the culture is to take that next step and reach out into our local communities and continue to and start to educate everybody else that's out there. So, you know, that's really what we need to, that's really what the next bunch of slides are all about, is talking about how we do this in much more detail. And I believe the next person up is fellow board member Sherry Dutzy.
Hello, everybody. I'm Sherry Dutzy. I'm in my second term as a state rep in New Hampshire. I live in Nashua, New Hampshire, which is on the border of Massachusetts. My first term, the Democrats were in the majority. This term, it's flipped, and we have a Republican majority that is pretty much controlled by a group called Free Staters and the Freedom Caucus. So in a lot of ways, New Hampshire is mirroring what happened on the federal level in 2016 to 2020. So do you have the next slide? Okay, so what we're going to talk a little bit about is how can the atheist and humanistic community increase its representation in the electoral arena. And in New Hampshire, I've often heard that New Hampshire is one of the least religious states in the Union. However, and I do believe that we have a lot of secularists in our legislature. We have the fourth largest legislature in the English-speaking world. But what's very interesting is that they're hidden. One of the things that I was very surprised about was when I was first elected, I didn't realize that when I went to House sessions, I was going to have to listen to convocations and go through a lot of religious things that I didn't think belonged in the government sphere. And yet everybody in the House, all 400 of us, stood there and listened to a prayer when I knew that there were probably a healthy minority of us who did not attend a church and were probably secularists. But being polite, everybody kind of stood up and went along with the motions. And so in my second term, I decided I wasn't going to do that anymore. And so so it's very interesting when we have a minister come in and say a prayer, I just sit there politely, don't stand up, and it hasn't been an issue. And in fact, one of the things we went through in New Hampshire was that we had a minister who was pretty much a Bible thumping minister. And that's when a lot of the secularists started to stand up and say they weren't going to stand for it and would stay out of the session until the prayer was over. So what I'm trying to say is I think there's a lot of us out there, but until we have the political will to stand up and say that we are secularists, we kind of stay hidden. So the next couple of slides are going to go over what you're seeing here is how to exercise your political power. So the first slide, and I assume that most of you or all of you are registered to vote. If not, you all know how critically important it is. Almost every election we hear somewhere in the country where an election is decided on one vote. So
Looks like we lost her.
All right, well, until Sherry comes back, I'll run through these slides. And yeah, please let Sherry in as soon as she's got it, stable internet.
Okay, so I'm back. Okay. Okay, so I'm back. Okay, so can I see the next slide?
I need to, there we go.
Okay. Yeah. And it's critically important to be an informed voter. And now today with the internet, there are just so many different ways that we can do that. In New Hampshire, we have one that's called Citizens Count. And what's really good about that is it really focuses on statewide elections. I would say a couple of things. It's critical that you try to find out the values of the people you're voting for. And it's critically important, two things. If you can't find any information about them, then that's a red flag, because they don't want to have their values out there for people to scrutinize. If you do find information on them, be very careful about the code words and look for what is left out. Of course, the code words are Christian, as opposed to Lutheran or Roman Catholic or secular, a secularist. In New Hampshire, obviously we have, policy issues as supporting the Second Amendment. That's pretty much a Christian national focus, in New Hampshire. So read them very carefully and try to get as much information as you possibly can, and never, ever just vote for a name, okay? Or just because this guy, you've heard his name or her name so many times, oh yeah, they're a good person, and you vote for them. One of the things that's happening in New Hampshire is we were identified as a state that was most likely to be overtaken by the libertarian free state movement, okay? And the reason for that is we still have a lot of small town government where you would have a town of 400 people. Decisions are made by town meeting that's held once a year. And it was determined that the goal was to get 20,000 people to move in from all over the country into New Hampshire, and then take over elected office. And school board is usually one of the first places that they start. Selectmen is another one, because in a town of 400, you'd probably have a select board of maybe 3 or 4 people. They can easily get elected. A lot of these positions, people don't want because they're very time consuming. So about, I believe it was about 20 years ago that this movement started. And basically what we're seeing now in 2020 is that it has come to fruition, and they have basically taken over the legislative process. And what we have seen this year is bills that were voted down in committee, okay, were placed into the trailer bill in the budget, okay, because they couldn't get them passed after a public hearing. They put them in the budget bill, and they had enough votes to pass the budget. And the governor went along and passed the budget, wrote it into law, because he is planning to run for the state Senate. I'm sorry, for the federal Senate. So now we have bills that the legislative process killed that we now have in law. And the reason they were able to do this is because a minority of radical legislators held the majority hostage, because if they decided to walk, then the majority party no longer had a majority. So it's very possible when you have a legislature that is pretty narrowly divided, that you can have a small minority on either side that is basically in charge of your legislature, because if they decide not to show up, then the majority folds. So this is really, really critical. You have to be paying attention. Yeah, so go ahead. Next slide, please. So besides, going on the internet and looking at how people, what values they stand for, the other thing you can do, and I'm sure you can do it in your state, we have it in New Hampshire, you go on, we have the general court, you go into the general court and you can sort on anything like gun control, education, and then you come up with all of the bills that were in session that year. And then you can go in and see how your legislator voted on those. And so, pick 2 or 3 issues that are important to you. Look at the bills that were put in that session. Look at how your legislator voted if they're up for re-election. And that'll give you a good idea of where they stand. Attending candidate forums and events. New Hampshire is a small state. We're the first in the, we're the first in the union primary. So, this is our bread and butter. I mean, we do this all the time. So the League of Women Voters has forums every 4 years when we vote for president. We have house parties for candidates that come through. So we really have, I think, what they call retail politics. We like to meet the candidates up close. I think, in a larger state, it's a little bit more difficult. But if you can attend Zoom meetings, it really does help to see them and get a feel for who they are as people. And so, with the next slide, it's hard to get people to do this, because if we had our druthers, we'd want to be doing something else. But if we want to keep our democracy vibrant, and right now I think a lot of times it's on life support, it really is important to invest your time and money and ask questions. Never be concerned, that you might be asking a stupid question. A lot of what I see is people don't ask questions because they're afraid they're going to look dumb, because they really don't understand how our government works. And I have to tell you, before I ran for office, I really didn't understand all of the nooks and crannies of our state government. I had civics, I understood the broad strokes. But I didn't understand about the fact that we have public hearings on every bill. How does a public hearing work? How can we have input into a public hearing? There's just a lot of things that people don't know about, and they're afraid to ask the question because they're afraid to look stupid. Well, find the legislator that wants to educate you, and I can tell you, most of my colleagues enjoy educating the public about what we do and how they can make a difference. So, please, just stretch yourself a little bit and ask that question, because, we're all learning all the time, and the more educated we are, the better we are. So the next slide is about educating your friends and family. And I have to tell you, I really try not to talk politics with people that I don't know, and I don't know their politics. A lot of people are uncomfortable about it. A lot of people, are not open to persuasion. If somebody opens up the subject with me, I will be free to talk about it. But in this very divisive time, I think
Looks like we lost her again, Ron.
All right. But it is important to make sure your friends and families share the research that you've done on candidates. Because that's, it's a great way
Can you hear me again?
Oh, there you go, Sherry. Yep, we got you, Sherry.
Hello?
Yep, we hear you, Sherry. Go ahead, Sherry.
Can you hear me? Ron, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Apparently she can't hear us.
No, I think we've, Sherry. All right, well, again, it's key to don't keep your knowledge under a basket. Make sure your friends and families know what's going on out there. Yep, we can hear you, Sherry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay, I got a really strange thing. Okay, so the next one is vote, vote, and vote in all contests, okay? And I wanna kind of leverage off of what Danny was saying. Last week, I spent 3 lunch hours listening to a group called, oh God, I've just blanked on it. RCV, ranked choice voting. It's RCV New Hampshire, ranked choice voting New Hampshire. And this is a group that's trying to get us to move to ranked choice voting. And one of the things that they said, with New Hampshire being a primary state, okay, and I think this goes for all primaries, the issue is you want a lot of people to run in primaries, okay, because it gives you more options. The problem is that it's the first past the post that wins. And they were showing statistics. We've had our last congressional primary on the Republican side, they must have had 10 people running, and the person who was the first past the post made it with 24% of the vote. Okay, which means that, what was that? 76% of the people who voted in the primary voted for somebody else. And this was the same thing when we had the Democratic presidential primary here. I would have loved to have ranked choice voting because we had, in my opinion, we had so many terrific candidates, and yet we could only vote for one, okay? And if we had ranked choice voting, it would have been much more reflective of how the people, how the people felt about a particular candidate. So, I think ranked choice voting is something that we should really think about in a lot of our elections. And I think it's going to allow the better candidate to make it to the top. In our caucus, we decided to do ranked choice voting, and it worked very well. The person who got the most votes on the first round was not the person that ended up winning. So it was a very interesting process. But anyway, vote and please vote in primaries, because that's where your vote has much more weight. So the next slide. If you can, meet with your elected officials. One of the things that I would underscore is it's good to have a dialogue with your elected official. Don't waste your time sending out, the form letters that we all get. Sign up here and they send a letter. I don't think most of my colleagues pay no attention to that. Okay, personally, I think it's a waste of time. The other thing is it's a waste of time sending a message out to your entire delegation. Only spend your time communicating with those people who you vote for. Okay, you are their constituents, and trust me, they pay attention to their constituents because you vote for them. Before I was elected, I heard this from an elected official and I said, oh my God, that's pretty arrogant. Having become an elected official, it's really true. You don't have a lot of time. You know, you can come back from a session and you can open up your email and you can have 200, 300 emails. Vast majority of them are the same thing. It's just a form letter and it's coming from everybody in the country. We had a bill in my committee, I'm in the Environment and Agriculture Committee, that had to do with puppy mills, okay, and trying to set up legislation so that we could control sick animals from coming into the state. I must have gotten 200 emails, a lot of them from Mississippi, Kansas, you know. It was a waste of their time. It was a waste of my time. But do pay attention to those you can vote for. And trust me, you know, elected officials do want to hear from their constituents. So I think that's it for me. And I will send it over to Ron.
All right. Thank you very much, Sherry. I'm Ron Millar. I'm the Political Impact Coordinator for the Center for Free Thought Equality. We're the advocacy and political arm of the American Humanist Association. And you might not know about us, but you might know about some of the work that we've done. We were instrumental in getting Jared Huffman to announce that he was a humanist and agnostic. We helped him create the Congressional Free Thought Caucus. And with our political action committee, the Free Thought Equality Fund, prior to the 2016 elections, we knew of 5 state legislators who identified with our community. And now we have over 60. And it was that bump that led Leonard Presberg to say, hey, we have a critical mass of elected officials. Let's form an association of secular elected officials. So that's how you have these folks here today talking to you. So what I want to talk about is how to politically empower our organizations. There is the false narrative out there that nonprofits cannot do political work or electoral work, and it is false. The thing you cannot do as a nonprofit, a 501c3, is endorse or appear to endorse political candidates or a political party. But there's all the civics education that you can do. And so that's what I want to encourage you to do. Because like we said before, we're a growing demographic. And we're large enough now that we can counter Christian nationalists and we can put away their anti-democratic, bigoted, racist, misogynistic, homophobic campaign, because we have the votes, we have the people, we just have to be organized and we have to be active. So, you know, the first thing is, it's reiterating, you know, please educate your members about what's happening, and it's basic civics education. And there are lots of things you can share with your membership. You know, the League of Women Voters has the Great 411 that allows people, you know, you can check your voter registration through them. You can see what candidates up and down the ballot are going to be up for election. And usually they have some more information, in-depth information on them. Ballotpedia is another great resource. Project Vote Smart. So if you run an organization, I really encourage you to have this information available for your members. Have a little, you know, elections or political page that you can provide these resources for your folks. And then of course, just beat the crap out of your members to make sure that they're all registered to vote, because we cannot have one member of our community not voting, and not voting in every election, because, you know, the local elections have a more day-to-day impact on your lives than the federal ones do. So, you know, make sure your people are registered, make sure they keep the registration when they move, make sure they're not part of the, you know, the blocking that they're trying to do to eliminate voters from their voter registration polls. So keep on your members. Do that basic civics education. Then as an organization, you're perfectly allowed to go out there and educate candidates and this makes them aware that your organization exists, and it makes them aware that we as a constituency exist. One of the most interesting things from the 2020 election is Pew in June just released some of their research, and it showed that atheists, agnostics, and the nuns, the NONES as they describe them, are 25% of the voting population now. Just in the 2018 election, we were only 18%. So it's a huge jump. So we are a constituency that needs to be recognized. And one way to do that is send out a little letter, talk about your organization, talk about our constituency, and the issues that are important to your group. And it's a great way to build relationships with the candidates that are out there. And the key thing you do is you send it out. If you target a race, or you send it out to all the candidates in the race. You can't play favorites. You've got to educate everybody that you're reaching out to for that election. And the best thing of all, and I'll be pulling this from all my slides, is there's this great resource called Boulder Advocacy, which provides all the information you need to make sure you're doing everything correctly. You don't want to get caught up and make it look like you're favoring one candidate over another. So their resources are completely free. They even have a thing where if you have a question about a gray area, you send off an email and they'll have one of their lawyers contact you. So it's a great resource. So again, but this is about building relationships. So the first step to build relationships is make sure the candidates know that you exist. Send out those letters. Then once you start building that relationship, you can start doing voter questionnaires. You add a survey to the information you send about your group or community, and you can do a questionnaire, and that turns into a voter guide. And I think, Judy, you've been doing this for some elections, so thank you very much for doing that. The opposition has been doing it for years. As you can see, I have two examples up here, the official true Christian nonpartisan voter guide. So they play a little fast and loose with some of the rules that Boulder Advocacy will give you. So don't use them as a model, but do follow their lead in pursuing these questionnaires and voter guides. There's also another great resource out there that it's called Secular America Votes, and they focus on voter registration and get out the vote efforts. And I'm sure if you invited them, they would love to do another presentation to you like this and tell you all about what you can do with voter registration and GOTV. Again, you have to do it in a nonpartisan way. But again, it's a great way to build the visibility of your organization with voter registration drives. Again, there are things you have to be careful about because everything is weaponized and politicized. But again, Secular America Votes can give you some great resources to make sure you do it correctly. And my favorite that I would love some of our groups to do, and actually several Virginia group did it in, I think, the last election, are doing candidate debates. And you don't have to jump in there and start from scratch. Look at the social justice work you're doing or other networks that you have, and co-sponsor a debate with another group or another set of groups. Again, it builds your visibility, gets your membership more involved in the process, and you build relationships with the candidates. And it's just a great way to ask those pointed questions that you want answered to make sure that the candidates recognize us as a constituency. So I would love to see more of our groups doing candidate debates. And if it's possible for you to do that, please do so. And again, I can't emphasize enough, Boulder Advocacy will tell you how to make sure you do it correctly. Oh, before we go to Kristiana, though, I just want to wrap up. And so also, once the election is over, invite elected officials and those candidates who even didn't win to speak to your groups, because again, it's a great way, I'll say it again, it's building relationships, and you want to build relationships with elected officials, not just from our community, but we need allies too. So invite them to speak to your group. Again, it makes them aware that we are a constituency that needs to be dealt with. So let me turn it over to Councilmember Kristiana de Leon. Thanks, Kristiana.
Hi, thank you so much, Ron. Thank you everyone who's here on this conversation today, and it's truly an honor to get to speak with you all. So yeah, I'm Kristiana de Leon, City Council member for the City of Black Diamond. I think earlier before we started this official conversation, we were talking a little bit about mining. So in case if anyone was curious about where the name of my particular city comes from, it comes from coal and coal mining. We are historically a coal mining town. And of course, before that, I'm speaking to you from the traditional and unceded lands of the Muckleshoot Nation. But anyway, that's just a little bit here about me, where I'm coming from. And while I am coming from the better Washington on the West Coast, the best coast, sorry, Florida, it's actually, you know, a lot of folks think about places like Washington State, or where I'm at in South King County, as being like sort of super, you know, progressive beacon of this and that. And I'm also here to say that not necessarily so. And my story of how I got into elected office absolutely speaks to that, and why it's really important to reiterate how critical it is to stay focused on local elections and how much they matter, and to reemphasize that point, while national politics is super important. And I know that especially you're all very familiar with it, as especially from your place in a swing state. It's how we really continue to work on building that bench on the super local level that really is what makes that difference. So a little bit about me. I grew up in a more of a Lutheran community or family. I even went to a Lutheran college, Pacific Lutheran University, for both my bachelor's and my master's. I'm sure we all have our deconversion stories. I have one as well. I started identifying more as an atheist, and especially though as a humanist, around the early 2010s, when I was really coming into that. But it really took until like this year for me to be really open and out about it. And it's really also because it's true to who I am, and it's who I've been for years. And even more, it's because I have been in direct, I guess, contact with, just put it mildly, with the rise in Christian nationalism, and how that's conflated and interrelated with white supremacy and white nationalism, which is really what also got me involved in serving in local office. Before I was serving, I was a long time I love to follow, you know, the political scene. I was a long time just volunteer. I was really inspired and especially energized by the 2018 midterms. There were some fantastic candidates, especially locally, who were coming out of it, who went on to do great and inspiring work. One of my heroes growing up was Senator Patty Murray, because that's where I saw I could one day serve. And that's, again, why representation matters. And that's why I'm also really inclined to be doing this work, is because when we see more of the actual members of our community being represented and representing, that's where we truly also make that difference. So I decided to file to run right during a filing season in May of 2019. I was teaching at the time. A lot of what I was doing also as a teacher was working with local community activists and members, and with as the school board and with the local city council, to try to work more on combating the frightening increase of hate speech and hate rhetoric from hate groups in our communities, and including in our school district. And it was the work around that language and accountability for electeds that made me go, you know what, I really need to be doing this in my own community, in my own city. So that might be actually a great segue to this next one about why I'd be running for office. So I filed to run in May 2019, just wanting to make that difference in my community. I was thinking about school board, I was thinking about city council. I chose city council because I really care about those policies and practices that extend beyond the schools. And because while I have that background in education, it was also really integral to me to be thinking about the climate crisis and about our environment and about zoning. My city in particular is quadrupling or quintupling in size in a few years. So really thinking about how are we going to be talking about, you know, inclusion and justice and equity for all in a community that's growing and changing so much was one of those ones where I thought we need to also have that work on the city and in partnership with our local school boards. So running for office, yes, that includes you. So we learned a lot so far about that important civic day-to-day engagement. And as somebody who came from that background of loving the get out the vote process, staying involved, listening, and then finally jumping in myself, I'm hoping that this is also what encourages you either to think about it for yourself or to highly encourage the folks in your network to be running as well. Pick the office that's right for you. And really, for one thing, I'm just going to say that a lot of folks who could be doing an amazing job serving are also some of the ones who are not necessarily going to think that I should be the one serving. You know, they're the ones who might be more like, I want to stay in the background, but they might have the best policy ideas, or they might be so good about connecting and communicating with others, but just encourage yourself and others to do that. And I think if we continue on with that previous slides really quickly, if we can go back. It's about messaging and making that campaign plan too, absolutely. So once you determine that, whether that's statewide, whether that's local, whether that's your fire and sewer district, hospital commission, all of those things are really important. In fact, I was supporting a candidate this current year who wanted to run for hospital commission because they really wanted to make sure that there was LGBT representation and how we were talking about policies in our hospitals. So there are a lot of really important ways to be making a difference in elected office that are often outside of the radar of what you think of. Messaging is important. Think about your whys. Why do you care about running? And then that campaign plan. Again, I decided to do this right during filing week. So while this is the beauty of participation in the process, there's a lot of good ways to do it that don't include saying, okay, I'm just going to file and see what happens. But it's really good to think about public finance or how you're going to be financing it. How are you going to talk about messaging? Who's on board? Getting some of those ducks in a row earlier rather than later, but it's still doable to do it later. Personally, so we can go on to the next slide here. Picking the right office, interests and ambitions, of course. Again, where are you really hoping to make that kind of an impact? Do you care about the environment? Do you, is that something that's especially front and center to you? Is it on education policy? Now, granted, I still care deeply about that. And yet I also thought there's still ways to make that inroad even on the city council. Terms and qualifications. Goes without saying, but you do have to be a registered voter, but there might be other things in addition with things like residency or other things as well. But hopefully your local, say, county office or some other jurisdiction, your Secretary of State's office can also help with some of those as well. Ballot access and fees, at least where I'm at, the more your office pays, the more you have to pay to run. So my office is pretty much just kind of small stipended. So I think I paid all of like $20 to run for office. Technically, that's all I would have really needed to do. But of course, thinking about that because it is still truly unfortunate that money does talk far too much in politics. And the more that you can just kind of know what upfront is just the absolute necessity of what you need for your campaign, again, the more you can plan ahead for that as well. Same thing with campaign disclosure rules. In Washington State, we have what's called the PDC or the Public Disclosure Commission. I don't know, it's one of those little alphabet soup names, but that's where we actually go to make sure that we are filing with them to be accountable to the public about who's financing, where our money is going, et cetera. So whatever that is in your local jurisdiction, make sure that is front and center with whenever you're planning to run for office. Because that's just one of those things that is obviously about ethical leadership and running for office, but even more, you don't want to trip out the gate because that was a box that we just inadvertently forgot to check. Issues and then incumbent. And this is what I find really interesting. I talked about my issues. So when I filed to run, I did not really know much about my incumbent. A week after filing, I learned that my personal incumbent was a leader of a 3% group and is actually completely connected with these far-right Christian nationalist groups. If you've ever heard of somebody named Matt Shea, he was a state representative in Washington State. He got some international press for his trying to train children for Christian warfare. So all sorts of just nutty things. And we have this kind of thing going on in Washington State. I had no idea. I didn't even know about these groups. I didn't know much about the Proud Boys or Oath Keepers or any of these things. And yet here it was in my city council. He was appointed into this office and I didn't know. And that's where it really hit home that like everything I was saying I wanted to run, my reasons for why were in complete contradiction to what he was about. So I would also though say, even still when you think about your incumbent, to take that with a grain of salt. I'm actually really glad that when I chose to file to run for office, I was doing it for my own reasons and not just to take somebody out, because there's no better reason to be running than to be running for your values. And for me, that's actually front and center of what it means to be running as for myself, like a secular humanist, is I want to make sure that my values are being front and center and part of this. About inclusion and diversity in our environment. Because It also feels better because then once you also get into that office, you're like, well, this is what I was planning to do. Not just the absence of something, like what do I not believe in, but what do I believe in? And that's also where this is really, really important. So incumbents matter, knowing that maybe you have a difference of values and opinion matters, but ultimately this should be about you and what you are hoping to bring to the table as a new voice. Next slide there. Yeah, so making the decision. Certainly nobody makes it alone. Think about the other folks in your network who are willing to support you. For one, family support. And I'm going to extend that to be also family of choice, you know, especially because I know a lot of us here in these circles, we're probably going to be talking about maybe on our own deconversion stories, we've had to rethink what that means to have family support and what our families look like. So family, asterisk family, family of choice, your friends, your other community groups, etc. That goes into networking. Who's going to be there to also support you, or who do you think? If you're not active yet in like a local like party chapter or legislative district, as we call them, you know, that's a great time to start exploring that. There are a lot of great organizations that do fantastic training. Some of them were also mentioned in previous slides. But that's also not just a great way to learn sort of the tips and tricks for running for office, but it's a great way to meet people who are like-minded, where you can kind of share those stories and be the ones that you talk to in like weird hours of the day. I was really grateful for my opportunity to connect with people such as in the Emerge network for women and non-binary people. So there's a lot of really great ways. And then just really cool stuff too. Once I filed, and this is not unique, it was like drinking out of a water hose. Like just, there were supports, there were people who came out of nowhere. So while I may have thought I had some support, it was overwhelming to see what really transpired when they're like, huh, who's this person who just filed? Let's get to know them. And I have made friends and I have had so many experiences that never in my wildest dreams would I have thought. And now when I talk to other new candidates, they're like, oh my gosh, it's a whirlwind. And it's so cool. Like, it's really, the more you get involved, I feel like there's, for all the things that are kind of nutty and sad and everything, there's also a lot of really cool and exciting things that happen with that network and continuing to expand on it. So that's definitely one of the pluses of getting to join in the electoral process. And then otherwise, messaging, again, just a little bit more about that. Answering a question, you know, and along the way, you'll probably either know a little bit about what you are wanting to bring to the table, and then in conversation with those communities, with your neighbors, you'll probably know even more of the kinds of questions that you're hoping you can better answer them as well. Messaging that tells a story, communicates your values, and of course, that is authentic to you. Because at the end of the day, what I see it as is when you're serving, you know, at the end of the day, are you feeling like you are being true to yourself and why you ran? Now, of course, I always want to accentuate, we learn things along the way. We learn better from other folks, you know, and this is where accountability comes into play, where maybe there are still ways to improve. Like, oh, I got this wrong, but I'm willing to keep learning. But I still think that is actually truly part and parcel with what it means to be authentic. Know your whys, but being open to that kind of change. And to me, that's also exactly what it means to be a humanist as well. So I tell my story, you know, and of course, some people want to hear different parts of what that means. But at the end of the day, it's one of my best things I got from one of those early trainings and candidacies was writing down your reason for why you ran for office. And I gave an early on practice like speech that really solidified me and made me think a lot about what brought me to this place. So even in those really difficult days on the campaign trail and really difficult days since I started serving, and I could tell so many more stories about the shenanigans that went down, that's what has also been one of the key things that's kept me grounded is when you're telling that story, you're also telling it for your own why as well. So let's see if there's anything more. And then a campaign plan, yay. Because of course we want to make sure that we have all those nice warm fuzzies about things that matter to us, but we also want to make sure that we do all the technicalities as well. When you're thinking about your networks, think about the people who are, if you're not one yourself, the policy wonks, or think about the people who love to run numbers or crunch data. When you continue to kind of find those different networks of support, there may be folks who will never, ever, 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 ever want to go door to door for whatever reason, but darn, are they really good at, you know, looking down at precinct number and finding out these kinds of different areas of support. Fantastic. That's kind of what I think of when there's win number. Now I'm going to tell you, I went through a training where we went all through calculating your win number, and I'm still like, that's for somebody, you know, like that's maybe for like a, you know, a consultant or somebody else on your team. But yeah, win numbers are important. Long story short, it's a matter of finding out how many doors do you need to knock. This is at least my understanding. How many doors you need to knock in order to reach out to enough voters where you could ultimately make that difference. Hands down, the best thing you can be doing is that door-to-door, person-to-person contact. And of course, with COVID and this Delta variant, that's got to be really difficult, but finding those ways to authentically connect with people, whatever that looks like, is going to be critical. Fundraising, earlier the better. And of course, that goes back to campaign finance laws. Please play nice, because I'm sure you all will, but I just love to accentuate there's nothing better than just showing where that's at for you. Targeting. So that just also means, what are the community groups that are especially going to be most likely to resonate with your message? A lot of people also focus on undecideds, but it's also really important to think about those lower propensity voters. One of my favorite things when I was canvassing and when I was getting to campaign in 2019 was getting to go door to door in areas that have not often been canvassed or didn't have any data for the first time. And I got to walk around with the voter registration sheets, and I got to talk about voting, or I talked to people who rarely vote, but when they do, they might be actually willing to turn in a ballot for me. And it was just so cool. And it was so cool to get to register people. So thinking a little bit more broadly, and that goes right back to that win number and finding your data folks who just love crunching numbers and finding out where you can make that difference. I really believe that with representation, you're also talking about making sure that people who feel left out of the process are going to be now front and center and empowered along the way. Hierarchy of contact methods. I personally take also mean at door to door, but say that's not possible right now, COVID, etc. Phone numbers, sometimes the numbers change, but think about your social media presence. Think about those networks, especially if people endorse you or you're getting those trainings. What are their ways that you can also kind of work with them and partner with them to make sure that that messaging is getting out through them as well? Then execution overall. So the more that you've kind of built that quote unquote kitchen cabinet, the more that you're going to have a really good solid game plan. Consistency is still going to be key. That goes straight back also to that authenticity as well. So let's see, next slide. Anyway, I guess that's also what brings us to the end here, so thank you.
So go ahead, Leonard, take it away to do question and answer.
Well, I'm going to exercise my prerogative and start with my questions and comments.
Go ahead, Judy. Sorry.
I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?
No, please go ahead. Sorry.
I recently read in National Geographic that there was a study done that said that 25% of the population can change the course of a nation. And we know that Christian nationalists are very close to that percent, and we know that we're very close to that percent. So we really got to get our act together, I think. I would like to thank Danny for bringing up Emma Goldman. It's not often you hear her name mentioned in today's society. Thank you very much. I also wanted to say that we do have in Florida the ranked choice voting movement going on. I'm not sure where it is now, but I'm not sure that the example in New York gave us a whole lot of support for that movement, but it is something that's being discussed, even in Florida, amazingly enough. And I did have one question about the form letters. I usually take the form letters, rewrite them in my own words, and then go to their website. We don't get the direct email addresses for our senators and representatives. We can go to their website and submit it on their website, and I usually do that. And I'm wondering what, Sherry, I think you're the one who brought this up, what your thought is on that process.
Yeah, Judy, I think that's fine as long as you're targeting, the person that represents you. Okay.
Yes.
You modify the letter a little bit to kind of let them know where you stand on it.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and I would, you know, some of the things that kind of get the hairs on my neck up is when you have some organizations that have these form letters, and what it'll say, right off the bat, it says, I am your constituent and I want you to vote, you know, for HB 122 or something like this. It's very like accusatory. You know, you don't want to be, you know, fawning, but on the other hand, some organizations just don't get it when they come off very strident like that. You know, it doesn't make you want to open up a conversation. So yeah, I would, you know, modify it, you know, to some extent with your language, and then the body of the letter can be the facts and figures that they've provided.
Right.
And, you know, you just always want to make sure that you're keeping the tone so that it's an open dialogue.
You forget that my senators are Marco Rubio and Scott. So they respond to me, but they're not friendly. So
Yeah. Yeah, we have adult recreational use of marijuana is coming up on our agenda tomorrow. You know, so you can imagine what my email looks like today. I got it down to below 50 while we were sitting here right now. You know, it's just like what Kristiana was saying, you know, it's like, keep it personal, keep it short, you know, don't try to jam 50 different arguments into there. You know, if you can say one thing clearly, cleanly, you've got a better chance of convincing somebody to do something that they weren't thinking about than if you just sit there and, I mean, honestly, you know, if you're not writing it personally, I'm not reading it probably because it's not resonating with me. Yeah, so it's keep it simple, keep it short, and especially when it's, you know, somebody you know isn't going to agree with you anyway.
thank you very much. Jim Peterson, you have a question, comment?
Yes, I think this is a fascinating discussion because we have been accustomed to thinking about ourselves as being relatively powerless. We're a small group. We have all kinds of difficulties from time to time, and our group tends to be somewhat older people here in Florida. But nevertheless, I think there's a powerful opportunity here that we can't afford to pass up. My question is, what do you think is the most engaging issue as far as the public is concerned? What is the thing that's most likely to connect us to them? And this is for any of our. Yes.
One of the things that I think is just front and center is anything related to climate crisis. You know, that's just an ongoing issue. Certainly, you know, what we're seeing a lot of regarding, like, you know, white nationalism, white supremacy is definitely still, I think, top of mind, and we can't ignore that or overlook it. And yet, when I also think about things that really speak to our higher values and for where I really think that we have more to say about actual policy that makes people's lives better, I really think about what are we doing on energy and conservation, on zoning, on making sure that our green spaces are protected, on also our housing and housing affordability, but also how that ties in with urban planning or suburban, exurban planning. And I also think that's something that, you know, I'm a millennial myself, but that's definitely front of mind for the millennial Gen Z folks as well, because, you know, I'm one of the last who can remember what it was like to not have to plan for example, in my area, forest fires and having forest fire season, you know, and now we're getting these record temperatures. I can see, it's kind of like I could see the dawn of the internet and now we're living with it. It's almost like the same thing where we're really on the cusp of a lot of these major things. And that sort of need for action and that need for forward thinking. And that's also where I think, you know, humanists, atheists, et cetera, where there's a lot of really, really important things to be said and done is, if I think this is the only life that we have, then it's really important that we have the best quality of life for everyone and that we don't have children growing up, you know, choking on the air they breathe. So I think still combating and directly saying, look, we speak to higher values than white nationalism, white supremacy is important. And I also think that in with that is saying, and also here are the things that we're doing to actually make people's lives better, because right now there's a whole contingency of people who are just running on this fear and using fear and intimidation to distract us from the things that truly actually need to be done. So once you call that bluff and say, look, you're not here to make people's lives better, you're here to bully, but here's what we're doing, I think that's going to be one of the biggest things we can do.
Thank you.
Jim, what I would say, it really is, you know, what is important to your community? I mean, I think there's two things here. What is important to your community, and are your values in sync with what's important to your community? Because all elections are local, okay? And when I decided to run, you know, my feeling was I'm putting my values out there. If people agree with my values, they can vote for me. If they don't agree with my values, they don't have to vote for me. One of the things here, and I think this goes across a lot of things, you know, public education. Two things, you know, people in my district support public education. The other thing that they don't like is tax dollars going to religious education, okay? And that's a big issue for national Christian nationals. And in fact, one of the horrible bills that we had passed, we now have the loosest voucher bill in the state, I mean, in the country, okay? So basically what they did, our Constitution says that there's a separation between church and state. So what they did with these freedom education accounts is they give the money to the parents, okay? And if you're within 300% of the poverty level for a family of four, which is like almost $80,000. So if your household income for a family of four is $240,000 or below, then you can apply for these education freedom accounts that have absolutely no qualifications. So if I want to use that money to send my kid, you know, any place, you know, religious, and so those are the things that voters on both sides really don't like. But, you know, I do not pander to the voters. I am who I am, you know, but I live in a community that reflects my values. And so you should be able to you know, could be climate change, public education, low taxes, providing a safety net, you know, I mean, so you have to kind of ferret that out.
Very good.
Of course, all the politicians in the call here want to take a shot at this question. I would just say one thing on it is that the more you can relate it to the daily life experience of the people that you're trying to talk to, the better off you are going to be. And that's in a couple of different ways. But the bottom line is that in community organizing, a community organizer does not go into the community saying, this is the issue. Community organizer goes in there and talks to people and finds out what their problems are and enables and helps them solve their problems. As a manager of people, I found, you know, it's like the more people I could find that could be passionate about what it was that they were doing, the less work I had to do. And it's the same thing here too, you know, so find out what people are really interested in and what they're passionate about changing. In my opinion, and I'll just throw one specific issue out there. I actually have a photograph or a print of a photograph, which is really real low resolution of the whiteboard that was during Clinton's first election. Up in the corner of it, it says, "It's the economy, stupid." You know, I think a lot of the anger and frustration we're seeing right now is because the American dream has become so far out of reach for so many people. And, I think finding ways to tie back into that, whether it's because of the climate or whatever, I think is probably, to me, it's probably the single organizing concept in a lot of the work that I do.
Thanks. In addition to that, what role do any of you think about coalition building? Does it play an important part, or should you just concentrate on your individual approach to campaigning?
I'd be happy to go first on that one too. I think this is also going to be a matter of speaking again to values. For me, my way that I see myself as a humanist means that I really truly believe in the power of pluralism. I live in a very diverse part of King County. South King County is home to some of the most diverse cities in the nation. And so while I'm coming at this with the lens of being a secular humanist and being an atheist, I really, really value and find importance in partnering with folks from other faiths when we do share those same values, you know. So, I mean, my community is my community because we also have members of the Sikh community, Muslim community, and people who are still Christians, you know, and yet are also coming to the table with these values on equity and inclusion and justice and the environment and on real education policy. So for me, I also see it as that willingness of like, where do we share those values and where do we want to really listen to each other and communicate? To me, that's also, even though I really see this as unto itself, this is the right direction for our, you know, diverse nation and communities to be going. It's really showing how this is the antithesis of this loud but vocal and bullying and voting contingency of folks who really are very reactive and against this kind of vision for a community that's truly representative of everyone. So I'd say, you know, in a long story short, I'd say think broadly and really think about, even if there are some things where we do have disagreements, you know, where are we still going to be able to work together to make people's lives better? And if I'm open and willing to listen to where people also share where they want me to be better, that's all part of the process too. So for me, it is, you know, if you do want to run, especially with a party affiliation, that's going to be part of it, but don't think just to that, you know. And I would also say, speaking to, again, your whys for why you would want to get involved and serve, and who's really sharing with those same values as well. And I think even a little bit to Sherry's point earlier that was being mentioned, education is going to be a really big part of this. It's so important to listen to your communities. And at the same time, recognize that there are plenty of community members who might be scared to speak out or say something. And so when you're able to really communicate your values, that's going to be really critical. I see that especially with education. As somebody who's in the education profession myself, who's also wanting to support a lot of great candidates who are wanting to get more involved in education policy, there's a lot of fear mongering around the quote unquote scare tactics, truths or scare quotes, CRT or critical race theory. That's completely false. It's a false narrative, and it's pandering to a lot of fear to try to make sure that all of these beautifully diverse communities are continuously marginalized and shut out from their own part of the decision-making process and how their education and how their history is being taught. There's nothing true about it, but really working with those groups to make sure that you are presenting that forward is going to be a really good way to do that. So finding also, you know, the unions that are going to be part of this, finding the conservancy groups. And I think this goes to, I think, Ron's point as well. There's a lot that can be done with 501c3s that may not be partisan attached, but are going to be front and center with how you're also talking about basic education on some of these premises. So much of what we're up against is just truly blatantly false information that's just being repeated over and over again in a way that, if we don't come forthright with our values, is just going to overtake that narrative and shut it out because it's just repeatedly the loudest voice in the room.
Thank you very much, Kristiana.
Yeah, I would say two things. We have 3 representatives, state representatives from each ward in our city, and we have 9 wards. So the 3 of us ran as a team, you know, And I think people liked that because they saw, I mean, we helped each other out. We knocked on doors for each other, you know, so it was really a team effort. So, you know, so that's one coalition. But the other thing is, as soon as you, you know, are on the ballot, you are going to have organizations contacting you, you know, with surveys. And if you complete their surveys and you answer them the way they like, you know, then they give you an endorsement. And you want to go after the endorsements that align with your values. So for example, you know, I got an endorsement from the Nashua Teachers Union because I support public education. I went after an endorsement for the Sierra Club because, you know, in the environment and conservation is big for me. You know, you get things like, you know, so I could have sent out completed a survey for the gun owners of New Hampshire. Chose not to, you know, that really is not my value. And, you know, and of course that goes against you. You go on, you know, you go on their website and then they'll say, you know, refuse to sign the, you know, fill out the survey. You know, that's just part of the game. But you can get endorsements from those organizations that align with your values. Did it really result in more votes? I doubt it because, you know, I only have 10,000 people or 9,000 people in my ward, so most of them didn't see it. But still, you know, I think it helps if people look at your not your website, but at some of the surveys you fill out and realize that and then when you get the endorsement, then you go up on Facebook or you go up on Twitter, you know, they give you the logo and then you let everybody know that you have that endorsement. So that's one of the ways to build coalitions.
I'll just add that even Stalin recognized the fact that you need to be able to work with other people. I mean, the fact that he killed people that he couldn't work with, you know, is probably the biggest sign of how important that is. I live in a state where 2 out of every 3 voters are voting totally against what I believe in. But at the same time, if I want to make anything happen, I have to find something common to work on. And usually it's a value statement, you know, that, you know, getting down to some form of value statement as it relates to daily life is usually the best way to connect.
Stalin made arguments you couldn't refute.
I stopped arguing with people a long time ago. Yeah.
Yep.
So are there
Well-
other questions or comments anyone wants to make? Speak up now. Getting close to the end of the meeting. I don't want to keep these people any longer than the time they've already taken from their afternoon. Nope. Well, thank you all so much. This has been so informative.
I think, is Francis, are you raising your hand?
Oh, Frank, you want to ask something? You're muted, Frank. You're muted, Frank.
Okay, how's that? Can you hear me now?
I have
Yes.
to teach you how to raise your electronic hand, though.
I don't know how to do that yet.
I will teach you.
I'm new to this. I just barely see the symbols because of eye problems I have. But I just wanted to emphasize getting involved in local elections. I used to be a very avid letter writer to the editor, and this was before the internet got hold. So newspapers is how we communicated. And we had 3 Christian values candidates running together as a slate. And they had 2/3 of 2 weeks before the election, they had 2/3 favorable vote. When I wrote a letter to the editor, all I had to do was take information from each of the organizations that they were representing, all Christian right candidates, and expose it in their own words. And within a week and a half, their popularity dropped to 1/3 of what they were. and they actually lost the election by that amount. That's a school board. That's how valuable getting involved in your local election is. One person can do it.
Yep, it's really true.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. Anybody else? I'll try to see if I can see hands, but if anybody sees a hand and I don't see it, let me know.
And I would add to what Frank said, if you can get a bunch of people together and buy a radio station, go for it.
Well, there's internet radio. You don't need a radio station anymore. It's all on the internet. You can do it. Run a public radio station.
The difference is with the radio station is you get a lot of people that like just are tuning in their cars as they're driving around.
Yes.
And
it's true. I laughed because one of our members runs a radio program called The Voice of Reason, and he has a weekly program so on the radio, and we keep trying to get him to buy the station, but he won't do it. So anybody else? Last chance. I want to thank you all so much for reminding us how it is so vitally important that we provide support for political candidates who understand the importance of facts and the separation of government and religion. That is one of our, I actually watched Pray Away today. I don't know if anybody else has seen it on Netflix. And it was so depressing about the influence that the Christian right is having on young people. These were especially, it's Pray Away the Gay is what it's based on. And it was just so disgusting what they were doing to young people. And it was so scary because they have united with the right wing, of course, and are moving in that direction. So it is, we need to keep this in the forefront. Plus, QAnon has announced that they're going to go after school boards.
They are.
I don't know, but it's scary. It's very scary. But anyway, so thank you all very, very much. It's been a pleasure having you with us. And I just want you're free to go and have a good rest of the afternoon. Enjoy, Kristiana, enjoy your nice weather out there. And thank you very much. And we'll be in touch on some of these activities.
Judy,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Judy, one more thing. The members of the Future Florida Scientists Committee could kindly stay over after this meeting so that we can discuss where we're going and what we're doing. Thank you.
And anybody who's interested in our science project is welcome to attend too. That we will give a few minutes of a break for people. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.